In 1850, no one outside the wealthiest corridors of New York banking had ever heard of Jekyll Island, Georgia. In 1890, it had been sealed from public access for decades. A private barrier island owned by a consortium of industrial millionaires who called their enclave the Jekyll Island Club, and who enforced its exclusivity with armed caretakers and iron fencing along the Georgia coastline. In 1908, its name appeared in no congressional testimony, no federal document, and no newspaper account available to ordinary Americans. By 1913, 6 men who had traveled there in secret had rewritten the monetary foundation of the United States of America. That is 5 years from seal to signature. And what those men built on that island still lives, hidden in plain sight, inside every banknote you have ever held in your hands. This is the story of what was encoded into the American dollar on December 23, 1913. And why the men who did it chose that specific date deliberately, carefully, and with full knowledge of what they were about to conceal from the American public for generations to come. Pick up any dollar bill. Hold it. Read what is printed across the top. Federal Reserve note. Not a United States note. Not a Treasury certificate. Not a silver certificate backed by metal held in a government vault. A Federal Reserve note. That single word, note, is a financial term with a precise legal meaning. It does not mean money in the civic sense that most people understand. It means debt. It means a binding instrument of financial obligation. It means that the paper in your hand is, at its legal foundation, borrowed. Before 1913, the United States government issued currency directly. United States notes, the kind Abraham Lincoln authorized in 1862 to fund the Civil War, declared on their face that they were obligations of the government itself, backed by the full weight of the nation's sovereign authority. After 1913, that ended. What replaced it is printed on the face of every dollar that has circulated in this country for the last 112 years. What was never communicated to the American public in 1913, or in any years since, is what that change actually meant. Who engineered it, where they gathered in secret to design it, and why the bill that encoded it was scheduled for a congressional vote on December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas, when most of Congress had already departed Washington for the holiday recess. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research, unless you tell it otherwise. Now, back to Jekyll Island, and the men who spent 9 days there in November of 1910 under strict orders never to mention its name in any document they produced. To understand what was written into every banknote after 1913, we have to go back. Not just a few decades. We have to go back to a world where the United States of America had no central bank, and where several competing private financial networks were fighting openly for dominance over the American money supply. In October of 1907, a banking panic seized the country. Trust companies in New York began failing within 72 hours of each other. Banks across the Midwest suspended payments entirely. Depositors formed lines outside locked doors in cities from Pittsburgh to Minneapolis. Factories shut their payroll offices and sent workers home. And in the middle of that panic, one man, John Pierpont Morgan, the private banker at 23 Wall Street, then 70 years old, stepped in, organized a private rescue of the financial system using his own network of institutional relationships, and stabilized the American economy almost entirely on his personal authority. Congress watched from Washington. And Congress was alarmed, not because the panic had been destructive, because one private citizen, answerable to no electorate, no regulatory agency, and no law, had held the power to stop it, or to let it continue. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller, Jr., and the most powerful single legislator on all matters of American banking, drew one conclusion from 1907. What the United States needed was not less consolidated financial authority, but a way to formalize it, to give it the permanent cover of government, to make it immune from the democratic reversals that had twice before destroyed central banking on American soil. In November of 1910, Aldrich organized the most secretive financial meeting in American history. He instructed the participants to travel separately to a railway station in Hoboken, New Jersey. He instructed them to use first names only, no surnames in conversation, not in writing, not in any record that might survive the journey. He told anyone who asked that the party was going on a private duck-hunting excursion. 6 men boarded Senator Aldrich's private rail car on the night of November 22, 1910. They traveled through the night to Brunswick, Georgia, then, by private launch across the tidal marshwater, to Jekyll Island. The men on that train were not officials of the United States government. Frank Vanderlip was president of National City Bank, the most powerful commercial bank in the country. Harry P. Davison was senior partner at J.P. Morgan. Benjamin Strong was head of Bankers Trust, and would later become the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. A. Piatt Andrew was Assistant Secretary of the United States Treasury, the single man on that train who held a government title, and whose presence gave the meeting its official credibility. Paul Warburg was a partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, a German-born financier who had spent the preceding decade publishing detailed arguments for the creation of a European-style central bank on American soil. Together, these 6 men represented an estimated 1/4 of the world's total investable wealth. They were not duck hunting, they were not on vacation, and they were not there by accident. They spent 9 days on Jekyll Island. They worked with the lights on past midnight. They drafted, revised, and debated the precise language that would govern the creation, distribution, and ownership of American money for the next century. When they left, they carried a complete architectural proposal for a new American monetary institution, one that would give the appearance of government control while preserving the essential mechanisms of private financial authority. Aldrich returned it to Washington, spent 3 years maneuvering it through the legislative process under a name carefully chosen to obscure its origins, and delivered it to Congress in December of 1913. Congressman Charles August Lindbergh of Minnesota, father of the famous aviator, a man who had served in the House of Representatives since 1907, and had spent 6 years reading every financial bill that crossed the congressional floor, rose to address the chamber on December 22, 1913, the day before the final vote. He stood before a chamber that was nearly empty. Most members had departed for Christmas. The press gallery held only a handful of correspondents. The legislators who remained had already committed their votes to party leadership. Lindbergh knew what the count would be. He spoke regardless. He told the chamber that the act would establish what he called the most gigantic trust on earth. He said it would legalize what he described as the invisible government of the money power, a phrase he had used in speeches for 2 years, speeches that the major New York newspapers consistently declined to print in their entirety. He stated plainly that from this day forward, depressions will be scientifically created. He warned that the act would transfer the right to issue money from the American people to a private banking consortium, and that once that transfer was made, it would be all but impossible to reverse through normal democratic means. That sentence about scientifically created depressions has been cited in financial histories for more than a century. Charles Lindbergh was not a fringe figure. He was not an unstable man. He was a sitting member of the United States House of Representatives, with 6 years of specific, documented institutional knowledge of the American banking system. He voted against the Federal Reserve Act. He was one of very few members of Congress who did. What the Federal Reserve Act actually created was not a government agency. This is the detail that the standard textbook account has consistently omitted. The Federal Reserve is a privately owned institution. Its 12 regional banks are structured as corporations. Their stock is held by member banks, private commercial banks, not the United States government. When the Federal Reserve creates money, it does so by purchasing government bonds, which is to say, by lending to the government at interest. Every Federal Reserve note that enters circulation represents a debt obligation of the American state to a privately held financial institution. The United States government has paid interest to that institution, without interruption, every single year since 1913, simply for the right to use its own national currency. That interest has never stopped. It has never been publicly accounted for in full. And the institution that collects it has never appeared on any ballot. This is not a theory. It is the operational mechanism described in the Federal Reserve Act itself, in plain statutory language, in a document that has been publicly available since the day it was signed. What was never made clear to ordinary Americans is what that mechanism means in practice. It means that money cannot enter the economy without simultaneously creating debt. Every dollar issued is a dollar owed. The pattern was not unique to the United States. In England, the Bank of England had been privately chartered since 1694. In France, the Banque de France since 1800. In Germany, the Reichsbank since 1876. In each case, the structure was functionally identical, a privately held institution with a government mandate to issue national currency, creating money as debt, collecting interest from the state it nominally served. By 1913, the United States was the last major Western economy without such an institution. The Jekyll Island meeting was not an invention. It was a completion. The final brick placed in an architecture that had been under construction, in one form or another, for more than 2 centuries across the industrialized world. 25 years after Jekyll Island, one of the 6 men on that train finally broke the silence. Frank Vanderlip, by then retired from National City Bank, published a first-person account in the Saturday Evening Post in 1935. He described the November 1910 meeting in specific detail. He wrote that the secrecy surrounding it had been so absolute that discovery by the press would have been, in his own published word, fatal to the entire plan. He wrote that they had been careful never to be seen together at the station, that they had used only first names for 9 days, that if any reporter had identified the group on Jekyll Island and reported what they were actually doing, the legislation would never have survived congressional scrutiny. Vanderlip was not writing this as a confession. He was not apologizing. He was writing it as a victory. The secret had held. The institution had been built. And by 1935, 22 years into the Federal Reserve's operation, the possibility of its democratic dismantlement had effectively closed. But here is what makes the American case different from every other account of central bank creation in the industrial era. The men who drafted the Federal Reserve Act knew, precisely and in documented detail, that American voters had already rejected a central bank twice. The first Bank of the United States, chartered in 1791 at Alexander Hamilton's insistence, had its charter allowed to expire in 1811 after Congress concluded that too much financial power had been concentrated in private hands. The Second Bank of the United States, chartered in 1816, was destroyed entirely by President Andrew Jackson, who called it a monster and spent the full length of his second term dismantling it. Jackson 1. The United States operated without a central bank for 77 consecutive years. The 6 men on that private railcar in November of 1910 knew this history better than anyone alive, which is precisely why they did not call what they were building a central bank. They called it a Federal Reserve System, a name that implies government authority, implies safety, implies reserves held on behalf of the public. A name that contains no reference to private ownership, to interest payments, to debt creation, or to the 9 days on a private island that produced its foundational architecture. The Federal Reserve has never adequately addressed several specific questions. It has never explained why the full ownership structure of its 12 regional reserve banks, including the identities and proportional holdings of its member bank shareholders, is not published in any form routinely accessible to ordinary citizens, despite those institutions holding a government monopoly on the creation of the national currency. It has never explained why the bill was scheduled for a final Senate vote on December 22, 1913, under calendar conditions that guaranteed minimal legislative attendance, minimal press presence, and maximum insulation from immediate public reaction. It has never explained why Senator Aldrich insisted that every participant in the Jekyll Island meeting was prohibited from acknowledging the others by name and any document produced during those 9 days, if the purpose of the meeting was, as the official account maintains, entirely technical and procedural. Why did the men who built this institution require 9 days of enforced anonymity on a privately owned island to draft legislation? Why did one of the nation's most powerful commercial bank presidents describe the possibility of public knowledge as fatal to the plan? Why would a system designed to protect Americans from financial panic need to be designed in secret, disguised in its naming, and voted on during a holiday recess? These questions do not disappear because institutions refuse to answer them. What we have is a signed, published first-person account from one of the 6 participants. A congressional record showing the chamber was largely empty when the act passed. A law that describes, in its own statutory language, a debt-based monetary architecture and a pattern of deliberate concealment that, even if it does not confirm the most extreme version of the claim, is something every adult American has a legitimate interest in examining. In 1916, 3 years after signing the Federal Reserve Act into law, Woodrow Wilson is reported to have committed to private correspondence a statement later cited across multiple historical analyses of his presidency. The passage attributed to him reads, in part, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." Historians debate whether these exact words appeared in a single document or were assembled from across his writings over several years. What is not disputed is that Woodrow Wilson, by the final years of his presidency, wrote and spoke about the Federal Reserve Act as a decision he had come to profoundly regret. He had been the instrument of its passage. He understood, eventually, what he had signed. The Federal Reserve System still operates from a neoclassical building at 20th Street and Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C., completed in 1937. If you walk past it today, no signage explains its ownership structure. No placard identifies its shareholders. No display acknowledges the November 1910 meeting that produced the legislation that built it. The Jekyll Island Club still stands on Jekyll Island, Georgia. It is now a luxury hotel and resort. For $20, you can take a guided tour through the rooms where the meeting took place. The guide will tell you about the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, and the Morgan family. If you ask directly whether the Federal Reserve Act was drafted in those rooms in November of 1910, the answer will be yes. If you ask what was decided in those rooms and why it required that particular degree of secrecy to produce, they will tell you they don't know. The official account tells us the Federal Reserve was created to protect ordinary Americans from the volatility of unregulated private banking, to end the era of panics, to stabilize the money supply, and to democratize access to credit. What the documents tell us is that the institution built to replace J.P. Morgan's personal financial authority was designed by J.P. Morgan's senior partners, drafted on an island belonging to Morgan's closest associates, named to obscure its private origins, and signed into law under calendar conditions specifically chosen to minimize public scrutiny. That is not a coincidence. That is a method. And once you understand what the word note means on the face of the currency you have carried every day of your adult life, you cannot look at it the same way again. These stories survive because people refuse to stop asking. If you have made it this far, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it is buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Next week, I am pulling a thread that connects the Federal Reserve directly to the death of Congressman Lewis McFadden. McFadden served as chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee from 1920 to 1931. He spent 4 years reading documents into the congressional record that named the specific institutions and individuals he believed had used the Federal Reserve mechanism to deliberately engineer the Great Depression. He survived 2 separate attempts on his life, once by a gunman outside a Washington hotel, once by poisoning at a political dinner in New York. He died in October of 1936. The official cause was cardiac arrest. He was 63 years old, in documented good health, and had been scheduled to appear before a congressional subcommittee the following month. That thread begins next week.